The scent of fermenting grapes hung heavy and sweet, almost cloying. Leo Maxwell scrubbed a stubborn stain of purple pulp from the stainless steel tank, the metal cold and unforgiving under his palms. October in Napa Valley was supposed to be idyllic, golden light, crisp air, the promise of a celebrated vintage. For Leo, it was just work. Endless, physical work designed to exhaust the ghosts. He hadn't intended to end up back here. Not at Bellamont, the winery his grandfather had poured his life into. The same place he'd fled from 15 years ago, a broken man. But the city had chipped away at him too. The noise, the sirens, the faces that weren't his here. At least, the rhythm of the seasons provided a semblance of order, a grounding force against the chaos in his head. The harvest was particularly brutal this year. A late bloom, followed by an unexpected heat wave, meant the grapes ripened all at once, overwhelming the small crew. Leo, surprisingly strong, despite years spent nursing a quiet despair, found himself working alongside a ragtag bunch of college kids and seasonal laborers. He kept to himself, offering terse directions. They didn't ask about his past. He preferred it that way. He paused, leaning against the tank, the lactic tang of fermentation stinging his nostrils. It wasn't the work he minded. It was the quiet moments, the gaps between tasks, when the memories surfaced. His wife, Sarah, her laugh, the way the sunlight caught in her hair. Then the blurry, fragmented images of the investigation, the faces of suspects, the growing dread. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it all back down. He hadn't been able to save her. And he hadn't been able to catch her killer. Old man Tiberio, Bellamont's resident cellar master, cleared his throat. Maxwell, inventory. Now, before Madame Dubois gets her perfectly coiffed hair in a twist. Leo nodded, pushing himself away from the tank. Madame Dubois, the current owner of Bellamont, tolerated his presence only because he was the last surviving family member with any practical knowledge of winemaking. She'd made it clear she intended to sell the property. And quickly. Leo was merely a caretaker, a temporary inconvenience. The cellar was the heart of Bellamont, a cool, damp labyrinth carved into the hillside. Rows upon rows of oak barrels lined the stone walls, their surfaces slick with condensation. The air smelled of oak, yeast, and thyme. Leo ran a calloused hand over the wood, a flicker of something akin to fondness in his chest. This was where he'd spent his childhood, trailing after his grandfather, learning the secrets of the vine. The inventory was tedious, logging each barrel's vintage, varietal, and aging status. Mostly it was routine, decade after decade of Bellamont's finest. But in the furthest corner, tucked behind a stack of newer barrels, he found it. A bottle, not the standard Bordeaux, shaped bottles Bellamont used for its reds. This was an old, squat bottle, the glass thick and faintly green, sealed with a crumbling cork. It was labelled simply, Bellamont Tuva Experimental Sauvin 1958. His grandfather's handwriting, faded but unmistakable. He hadn't known his grandfather, experimented with anything beyond the usual Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay, resistant to change. This bottle was an anomaly, curiosity, a sensation he hadn't, felt, in years, piqued his interest. He carefully maneuvered the bottle, avoiding disturbing the dust that coated its surface. The cork crumbled when he tried to pull it, sending a shower of dark granules into the bottle's neck. A musty, almost vinegary scent escaped. Leo angled the bottle, peering inside. He expected a dark, oxidized liquid. Instead, he saw a tightly rolled piece of paper, stained and waterlogged. He fished it out with a pair of tongs, laying it carefully on a clean cloth. The paper was brittle, fragile. The ink had bled in places, making the handwriting difficult to decipher. It was a woman's hand, elegant and spidery. He could make out a few words at first, help me, and then, please, they know. The paper smelled faintly of roses and something else, something metallic. He painstakingly unfolded the paper, the edges tearing slightly. The ink was so faded he had to hold the paper to the dim cellar light, squinting to make out the words. The 14th of October 1992, Daniel. I am so scared. He found out. They all found out. I told you. I shouldn't have said anything. He is watching me. They're always watching. Please, you have to believe me. Meet me at the Harvest Festival, the old pavilion by the creek, Saturday night. It is the only place we can talk. If you don't come, I don't know what will happen. Clara Moreau. Leo's breath hitched. The name hit him like a physical blow. Clara Moreau. He knew that name. He'd lived that name. Clara Moreau was the victim, the one he'd failed to protect. The case that had destroyed his career, his marriage, his life. He'd been a rising star in the Napa County Sheriff's Department then, young, ambitious, with a knack for solving difficult cases. Clara Moreau had been a local artist, known for her vibrant paintings of the vineyards. She disappeared during the Harvest Festival in 1992. Her body found a week later near the same creek mentioned in the note. The investigation had been a whirlwind of dead ends, conflicting testimonies, and mounting pressure. Leo had pursued every lead, interviewed dozens of suspects, but the case had gone cold. No arrests had been made. The whispers started, questioning his competence, accusing him of overlooking crucial evidence. The scrutiny had been relentless. His personal life had crumbled under the weight of the investigation. Sarah, unable to cope with his obsession and the constant threats, had left him. Then, the internal affairs investigation, fueled by anonymous tips, had found procedural errors, minor infractions, magnified into damning accusations. He'd resigned, disgraced. He hadn't thought about Clara Moreau in years, not consciously. The memory was too painful, the guilt too overwhelming. He'd tried to bury it, to rebuild his life, to pretend it hadn't happened. But now, here it was, resurrected from the darkness, a ghost from his past whispering accusations in his ear. The note, hidden in a bottle of his grandfather's wine, a desperate plea for help, dated the night Clara Moreau disappeared. It didn't make sense. Why would a note like this be hidden in his grandfather's cellar? What was Daniel supposed to do, and why hadn't it resurfaced during the original investigation? He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his mind racing. Had the original investigation overlooked something crucial? Had evidence been intentionally concealed? Had his grandfather known something he hadn't told anyone? The Harvest Festival, the old pavilion by the creek, the 14th of October, 1992. The date, the location. He vaguely remembered the festival. He'd been a young deputy then, assigned to crowd control. He remembered the music, the laughter, the smell of fried food. He remembered a woman with fiery red hair sketching portraits near the creek. Could that have been Clara Moreau? He couldn't be sure. His memories of that night were hazy, fragmented, lost in the fog of time. But one thing was certain. This note changed everything. It reopened the case. It cast a shadow over his fragile peace, and it threatened to unravel the life he'd so carefully constructed. He carefully folded the note, his fingers trembling. He had to show this to someone. But who? The current sheriff undoubtedly wouldn't take him seriously. Leo Maxwell, the disgraced ex-cop, the man who'd failed to solve a decades old cold case. He glanced around the cellar, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable. Was he being watched? Was someone trying to send him a message? Or was this just a cruel twist of fate, a macabre reminder of his past failures? He heard footsteps approaching the cellar entrance, Madame Dubois's voice, sharp and demanding. Maxwell, Are you still down there? We have a buyer coming to look at the vineyards this afternoon. I need you to tidy up this mess. Leo quickly tucked the note into his jacket pocket, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to appear calm, composed. He couldn't let Madame Dubois, or anyone else, suspect that he'd discovered something that could shatter the carefully curated façade of Bellemont Winery. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. He had to play along, to pretend everything was normal, but underneath the surface a storm was brewing. The ghosts of the past were stirring, and Leo Maxwell knew, with a sickening certainty, that his life was about to change forever. As he turned towards the cellar entrance, a single, unsettling thought echoed in his mind. If he looked closely at the festival photos from 1992, would he find his younger self? Talking to Clara Moreau, the fluorescent lights of the Napa County Sheriff's Department archive room hummed with a dull, oppressive energy. Dust motes danced in the beams, illuminating rows of decaying cardboard boxes, the forgotten remnants of solved and unsolved cases. Leo hadn't been inside this room in 15 years, and the air felt thick with regret. He'd pulled every string he had to get access, leveraging a distant acquaintance who worked as a records clerk. He'd claimed he was researching family history, a flimsy excuse even he didn't believe. Sheriff Brody, a man who'd once called him a friend, hadn't offered any assistance, only a gruff warning about disturbing the peace. The Clara Moreau file was surprisingly thin. A few crime scene photos, witness statements, and the original detective's notes, his notes. Leo ran a hand over the manila folder, a wave of nausea washing over him. He'd meticulously documented every detail, or so he'd thought. He started with the initial reports. The first officers on the scene had noted the lack of forced entry at Clara's cottage. Her art supplies were undisturbed, and nothing appeared to be stolen. It had been ruled a homicide almost immediately, but the motive remained elusive. He flipped through the witness statements. They were frustratingly vague, filled with contradictions and half-remembered details. He remembered the frustration of those initial interviews, the feeling of chasing shadows. But now, reviewing them with fresh eyes, he noticed discrepancies he'd overlooked before. Old Man Hemlock, the owner of the general store near the festival grounds, had claimed to have seen Clara arguing with a man shortly before her disappearance. Leo's notes indicated Hemlock couldn't identify the man, describing him only as well-dressed city type. But a handwritten addendum, barely legible, suggested Hemlock had been reluctant to cooperate, offering a different description to a different deputy. A description that vaguely matched Julian Vance, one of Napa's wealthiest and most influential vineyard owners. Leo frowned. He vaguely remembered Hemlock being evasive, dismissing Vance's potential involvement as ridiculous. He'd accepted the explanation at the time, focused on other leads. Now it felt like a deliberate blind spot. Had he been steered away from Vance? By whom? He dialed Sheriff Brody's number, ignoring the nagging dread in his gut. Brody. The voice was clipped, devoid of warmth. It is Leo. I was hoping we could talk about the Moreau case. I came across some inconsistencies in the old files. A sigh. Leo, we've been over this. The case is closed. Clara Moreau's murder remains unsolved, and frankly, digging it up again won't bring her back. But there is a new piece of evidence, Leo said, carefully choosing his words. An anonymous note, found in an old bottle at Bellemont. It suggests Clara was in trouble, that she was afraid of someone. Brody's tone hardened. An anonymous note, found in an old bottle. That is hardly solid evidence. Leo, sounds like someone's playing games. I believe it warrants a second look. Hemlock's testimony. I find it strange that I didn't pursue the lead regarding Vance with more vigor. Vance has an alibi, Leo. A solid one. He was at a charity gala in San Francisco that night, with dozens of witnesses, and frankly, You were under a lot of pressure back then. Mistakes happen. Mistakes, or were they, encouraged? Leo couldn't help the edge in his voice. Watch it, Leo. You're bordering on insubordination. I'm telling you, leave it alone. You've got your vineyards, your quiet life. Don't jeopardize it by chasing ghosts. Brody hung up. Leo stared at the receiver, his knuckles white. Brody was protecting someone. He was sure of it, but who and why? He needed to find someone who remembered the Harvest Festival of '92. Someone who wasn't afraid to talk. He drove to old man Tiberio's farm, the scent of hay and livestock filling the air. Observant man who knew everything that happened in the valley. Tiberio's memory wasn't what it used to be, but the mention of the festival sparked a flicker of recognition. Clara Moreau, pretty girl. Always sketching, used to sit by the creek, capturing the light. He paused, stroking his beard. Sad thing, what happened to her? Real tragedy. Did you see her that night, Tiberio, at the festival? I saw a lot of people, Leo. Festival was packed, but I remember her arguing with Julian Vance. Heated discussion by the pie-eating contest, if I recall correctly. Leo's pulse quickened, arguing. Do you remember what they were arguing about? Tiberio shook his head. Just snippets, something about a painting and money, maybe. Seemed like Vance was upset, very forceful. I didn't pay much attention, didn't want to get involved. He then mentioned seeing Clara leave the festival alone, visibly upset. She was wearing a small, pale pink rose on her lapel. A single rose. Leo felt a jolt, a sudden rush of adrenaline. The rose, he remembered. He hadn't thought about it in years, but the image flashed in his mind to be Clara, standing by the creek, the single, delicate rose, a stark contrast to her dark hair. He'd noticed it because Sarah had pointed it out. It is beautiful, she'd said. So simple, yet so elegant, it suits her. And then a fragmented memory surfaced. As he'd walked his patrol route, he'd briefly spoken to Clara, offering her a ride home. She'd politely declined, saying she just needed some air. He'd glanced at Vance, who was watching them from across the makeshift stage, a dark expression on his face. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just a passing observation. He hadn't included it in his report. Why? He couldn't remember. A mental block, a deliberate omission. He thanked Tiberio, his mind reeling. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture was still incomplete, distorted. He spent the rest of the day interviewing people who'd been at the festival, a former band member, a food vendor. Each conversation yielded fragments of information, conflicting accounts, and a pervasive sense of unease. People remembered Clara, but their memories were filtered through the lens of time, clouded by guilt, or deliberately obscured. Several people mentioned seeing Vance at the festival, but no one could corroborate Tiberio's claim of an argument. They described him as being jovial, charismatic, the life of the party. But Leo couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something, protecting someone. The silence was deafening as darkness descended. Leo sat alone in his office at Bellamont, staring at the faded note. The smell of the wine cellar, usually comforting, felt oppressive. He ran his fingers over the fragile paper, tracing the curves of Clara's handwriting. He'd spent years running from his past, trying to bury the guilt and regret. But now, the past was demanding to be heard, and he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that he couldn't ignore it any longer. He closed his eyes, summoning the image of the Harvest Festival, the music, the laughter, the smell of autumn. And then a vivid image flashed into his mind, tooting Clara Moreau, arguing with Julian Vance. Vance's face contorted with anger, his voice rising above the crowd. He remembered the unsettling look in Vance's eyes, a cold, calculating gaze he'd never forgotten. A detail he'd consciously, or subconsciously, suppressed for 15 years. A detail that could change everything. Vance Estate loomed over the Silverado Trail like a fortress, gated, meticulously landscaped, and radiating an aura of unearned privilege. It was a testament to Julian Vance's success. Leo parked his aging Ford pickup at the bottom of the long winding driveway, feeling acutely out of place. He hadn't worn a suit in years, and the borrowed one felt stiff and restrictive. He'd attempted to schedule a formal interview, but Vance's secretary had been politely dismissive. He'd been granted a courtesy call, a 5-minute window to state his business. It wasn't encouraging. The house itself was a sprawling Tuscan villa, all terracotta tiles and arched windows. A uniformed security guard scrutinized him before buzzing him through the gate. As he drove up the driveway, Leo noticed surveillance cameras mounted on every corner of the estate. He felt like a trespasser. Vance greeted him in a lavishly appointed study, all dark wood and priceless artwork. He hadn't aged well. His face was lined and weathered, his eyes cold and calculating. He offered Leo a glass of water, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Leo Maxwell," Vance said, his voice smooth and condescending. "It has been a long time. I heard you were back in the valley, running the family winery, I believe." "That is right," Leo said, keeping his voice level. "I'm investigating the Clara Moreau case." Vance's smile vanished. "The Moreau case? That is ancient history, Mr. Maxwell." A tragic event, of course, but long closed. A note surfaced, Leo said, placing a copy of the faded message on Vance's opulent desk, suggesting Clara was afraid of someone, and there were reports of an argument between you and her at the Harvest Festival in '92. Vance glanced at the note, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. A note, preposterous. I barely knew the woman. As for the argument, I recall a brief conversation about a painting she was trying to sell. I wasn't interested. Several witnesses place you arguing with her, Mr. Vance. A rather heated discussion. Vance leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. People remember things differently after all this time. And frankly, I find your line of questioning rather disrespectful. I've built a life, a reputation. I won't have it tarnished by revisiting old tragedies. With all due respect, Mr. Vance, a woman was murdered. Someone got away with it. Vance's voice dropped, becoming dangerously soft. Let me give you a piece of advice, Mr. Maxwell. Some stones are best left unturned. You have a business to run, a livelihood to protect. I wouldn't want to see anything unfortunate happen to Bellamont. The subtle threat was unmistakable. Leo stared back at Vance, refusing to flinch. Are you threatening me? Vance chuckled, a chilling sound. Just a friendly observation. Napa Valley is a small town, Mr. Maxwell. People depend on each other. It is always wise to maintain good relationships. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a board meeting to attend. Leo left the Vance estate feeling shaken, but more determined than ever. Vance was hiding something. He was afraid, and that confirmed everything. Back in town, he started digging. He spent hours at the county records office, poring over financial documents, land deeds, and business licenses. He discovered Vance had been facing significant financial difficulties in the early 90s, amassing substantial debt. Clara Moreau's paintings were gaining value at the time. A substantial amount of money could have been made by selling forgeries. He also learned about Vance's personal life. He'd been married for over 30 years, yet rumors of infidelities were rampant. And then he found it. A grainy photograph in an old society magazine, depicting Vance with a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Clara Moreau. a retired journalist named Marlene Diaz. She confirmed Vance had been having a discreet affair with a woman named Isabelle Rousseau, a struggling artist who'd recently moved to Napa Valley. Rousseau had disappeared shortly after Clara's murder, leaving no trace. Vance was obsessed with her, Diaz said, her voice hushed. He showered her with gifts, took her on lavish trips, but it was a secret affair. His wife suspected nothing. According to Diaz, Rousseau was a talented painter, but her style was similar to Clara Moreau's. Leo pieced it together. Vance was using Rousseau to replicate and sell forged Clara Moreau paintings. Clara had discovered the scheme and threatened to expose him. Was that what prompted the argument at the festival? Was that why she was silenced? He felt a surge of anger, a burning desire to see Vance brought to justice. But he also felt a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. He was poking around in dangerous territory, and Vance clearly wasn't afraid to play dirty. That night, he found out just how dirty. He arrived at Belmont to find the front gate smashed open, the vineyards vandalized. Vines were ripped from their trellises, irrigation lines were severed, and someone had painted threats on the winery's exterior. "Stay out of it, Maxwell." Madame Dubois was apoplectic. "This is a disaster, a catastrophe. You have to drop this investigation, Leo. This is ruining my sale." Leo's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a warning to him. It was a threat to everyone connected to Belmont. He spent a sleepless night patrolling the property, his old service weapon secured in his waistband. The quiet of the vineyards felt menacing, filled with unseen dangers. Desperate for answers, he turned to the one place he'd avoided until now. His grandfather's workshop. It had been sealed off after his death, a shrine to a man he barely remembered. The workshop was cluttered with tools, sketches, and half-finished projects. The air smelled of sawdust and varnish. He carefully sifted through the debris, searching for anything that might shed light on his grandfather's connection to the Moreau case. Behind a false panel in his grandfather's antique desk, he found a hidden compartment. Inside, neatly stacked, were newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. Clippings about the Clara Moreau case, but there were also clippings about her father, Daniel Moreau. Daniel Moreau had been a renowned investigative journalist, known for his fearless reporting on corruption and organized crime. He'd been working on a story, a sprawling expose, that implicated several prominent figures in Napa Valley in a network of illegal activities, Sudan land fraud, money laundering, and political bribery. The last article Daniel Moreau had written, before his untimely death, ruled a heart attack. Mentioned Julian Vance by name. It alleged Vance had been involved in a scheme to illegally acquire prime vineyard land, using intimidation tactics and fraudulent documents. Leo stared at the clippings, his mind racing. It wasn't about a painting, it was about power, money, and corruption. Clara wasn't just an artist. She was the daughter of a man who knew too much. And Julian Vance had silenced them both. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight, illuminating his grandfather's workshop. Leo ran a finger across the brittle yellowed newsprint, the names and dates blurring through a haze of disbelief. Daniel Moreau hadn't been investigating just corruption. He'd been dismantling a carefully constructed web of power that reached into the highest echelons of Napa Valley society, and Julian Vance was at the center of it. But something else caught his eye. Tucked amongst Daniel Moreau's articles were handwritten letters, addressed to his grandfather. The correspondence revealed a secret alliance. Edward Maxwell hadn't simply been a respected winemaker. He'd been a silent partner, providing Daniel Moreau with crucial information and financial backing for his investigation. "He was a brave man, your father," one letter read. "He is poking the bear, and the bear is starting to growl. I'm providing him with everything I can, but I fear for his safety. Leo felt a pang of guilt. He'd always perceived his grandfather as a reserved, cautious man. He'd never suspected this hidden life, this willingness to risk everything for justice. He felt a strange connection to both men, bound by a shared commitment to truth, separated by decades. The last letter from Daniel Moreau was dated 3 weeks before his death. The next document was a brief, cryptic note from Edward Maxwell. "I can't continue. It is too dangerous for everyone." Leo's blood ran cold. What had happened in those 3 weeks? What had driven his grandfather to sever ties with Daniel Moreau? Had he been threatened, intimidated, or had he discovered something so disturbing that he'd felt compelled to protect his family? He returned to the workshop, meticulously examining everything, searching for another clue. He ran his hand along the shelves, pausing when he reached a collection of old Belmont wine labels. His grandfather had been a meticulous record keeper, cataloguing every vintage, every batch. Something felt off. He pulled down a box of labels from the 1990s, arranged alphabetically by year. He noticed subtle inconsistencies, minute variations in the design, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. Certain letters were slightly bolder, different shades of ink were used, tiny symbols were embedded within the floral patterns. It was random. It was intentional. He remembered his grandfather spending hours meticulously designing the labels, obsessing over every detail, claiming it was about branding and tradition. It was a lie. He'd been communicating in code. He grabbed a magnifying glass and began the painstaking process of deciphering the hidden messages. It was a simple substitution cipher, a rudimentary method of encryption he'd vaguely learned about during a brief stint in the sheriff's academy. Each letter corresponded to a number, and the numbers formed coordinates. Hours later, surrounded by stacks of wine labels and scribbled notes, he cracked the code. The messages revealed a list of names, dates, and parcel numbers. They corresponded to a series of land disputes that had occurred in Napa Valley during the early 1990s. Seemingly unrelated cases involving small family vineyards being forced to sell their land to larger corporations. One name kept appearing on the list, Julian Vance, and one parcel number, repeated more often than any other, pointed to a particularly valuable piece of property nestled in the Oakville appellation, a prime location for growing Cabernet Sauvignon, a property that Julian Vance now owned, the plot of land known as Blackwood Ridge. The pieces clicked into place. Daniel Moreau had been investigating the fraudulent land grabs orchestrated by Julian Vance and his associates, using intimidation, threats, and legal loopholes to force small vineyard owners off their land. His grandfather had been helping him, providing evidence and support. Then something had gone wrong. Leo traced the history of Blackwood Ridge. It had been owned by the Rossi family for generations, a small, independent vineyard that had stubbornly refused to sell. According to the county records, the Rossis had suddenly and unexpectedly agreed to sell the property to a shell corporation, controlled by Vance, just weeks after Daniel Moreau's death, and shortly after Edward Maxwell had stopped assisting Moreau. He knew Julian Vance was ruthless and powerful, but the extent of his corruption was staggering. He'd engineered a conspiracy that spanned decades, silencing anyone who stood in his way. He was about to call Sheriff Brody, despite their strained relationship, when the phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID, unknown number. A cold, synthesized voice echoed through the receiver. "Mr. Maxwell, you're digging where you don't belong." Daniel Moreau made the same mistake. Some things are better left buried. Drop the investigation now. The line went dead. Leo sat frozen, the phone clattering to the floor. He felt a surge of adrenaline, followed by a chilling wave of fear. He wasn't just facing a powerful businessman. He was facing someone who was willing to resort to violence to protect their secrets. He looked around the workshop, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't safe. His family wasn't safe. He'd stumbled into a nest of vipers, and he knew, with sickening certainty, that he'd become a target. But he couldn't back down. Not now. He owed it to Clara Moreau, to Daniel Moreau, to his grandfather. He would expose the truth, even if it cost him everything. He grabbed his jacket and headed for his truck, a sense of dread hanging heavy in the air. He had a feeling he was running out of time. The harvest moon hung swollen and orange in the inky sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the Vance Estate. It felt like a fitting backdrop for a reckoning. Leo drove through the gate, ignoring the renewed security presence. He wasn't asking for permission this time. He found Vance in the same study, sipping brandy and gazing out at the manicured lawns. The facade of composure was gone, replaced by a simmering rage. "You should have taken my advice, Maxwell," Vance said, his voice dangerously low. "You've made a serious mistake." Leo laid a file folder on the desk, filled with copies of the land deeds, coded wine labels, and Daniel Moreau's articles. "I have proof, Vance. Proof of your illegal land grabs, your intimidation tactics, and your involvement in Clara Moreau's disappearance." Vance scoffed. "Circumstantial evidence, fabrications. You're building a house of cards, Maxwell, and it will collapse. The wine labels. Labels don't lie. Daniel Moreau's investigation doesn't lie. And the Rosses don't lie. They were terrified of you." Leo paused. "You wanted Blackwood Ridge. You used any means necessary to get it. And Clara Moreau was the one who threatened to expose you." Vance's face contorted with fury. "That woman was a nuisance, a troublemaker. She was spreading lies, trying to ruin my reputation. She was trying to expose your crimes, and you silenced her." "I didn't kill her," Vance roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "I merely paid someone to dissuade her, to scare her into silence." Leo's blood ran cold. "You hired someone to hurt her." Vance hesitated then, nodded slowly. "A regrettable necessity. She was becoming a liability. And what about Daniel Moreau? Was he also a liability? He was a meddling fool sticking his nose where it didn't belong. I offered him a settlement, a generous one. He refused. So you arranged for his heart attack." Leo's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't arrange anything. I simply encouraged events to unfold naturally." The admission was chilling. Leo felt a surge of adrenaline, followed by a cold, calculating calm. He'd spent years honing his detective skills, and now it was time to use them. "You underestimate me, Vance," Leo said, his voice steely. "I know you didn't act alone. You had help, someone on the inside." Before Vance could respond, the study door swung open and a man stepped inside. It was Old Man Hemlock, the general store owner. But he wasn't the frail, harmless old man Leo remembered. He was holding a silenced pistol, his eyes cold and unwavering. "Sorry, Leo," Hemlock said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But Mr. Vance pays well, and I have a family to support." Leo recognized the familiar weight of dread. He'd underestimated the scope of the conspiracy, the desperation of those involved. He remembered Hemlock's evasiveness during the original investigation, his reluctance to identify the man arguing with Clara. It had been Hemlock all along. "You were the one who vandalized Bellamont, weren't you?" Leo asked, keeping his voice calm. "Sending a message." Hemlock didn't answer. He raised the pistol, aiming for Leo's chest. Leo reacted instinctively, diving behind a heavy mahogany desk, just as a muffled shot rang out. Splintered wood exploded around him. He'd spent enough time on shooting ranges to recognize the telltale signs of a professional hitman. Hemlock wasn't just a store owner. He was a trained killer. The study erupted into chaos. Leo scrambled to his feet, using the desk as cover. He knew he was outgunned, outnumbered, but he also knew the layout of the estate. He'd spent hours studying the blueprints, trying to anticipate Vance's defenses. He darted around the desk, dodging another shot. He spotted a heavy crystal decanter on a side table and grabbed it, hurling it at Hemlock. The decanter shattered against the wall, momentarily distracting the hitman. Leo used the opportunity to close the distance, tackling Hemlock to the ground. They grappled, rolling across the expensive Persian rug. Hemlock was surprisingly strong, but Leo was fueled by adrenaline and righteous anger. He managed to wrench the pistol from Hemlock's grasp, tossing it across the room. Vance, meanwhile, stood frozen, watching the struggle with a mixture of fear and fascination. "You're a fool, Maxwell," Vance shouted. "You'll ruin everything." Leo ignored him, focusing on subduing Hemlock. He used a series of leverage techniques he'd learned during his police training, disarming him and pinning him to the floor. "It is over, Hemlock," Leo said, breathing heavily. "It is all over." Just as he was securing Hemlock, Vance let out a harsh laugh. "You think you've won, Maxwell," he said, his eyes gleaming with madness. "You think you've solved the mystery. You have no idea. You're only scratching the surface." He paused, then delivered a chilling revelation. "Clara Moreau isn't dead." Leo froze, his mind reeling. "What did you say?" "She is alive, hidden away, protected by someone who feared what would happen to her if she came forward." Vance's voice dripped with a perverse satisfaction. Someone who believed she was better off disappeared. A friend of her father's. They helped her vanish, created a new life for her, a life far away from here. He met Leo's stunned gaze, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You've been looking for a ghost, Maxwell, and all along, she has been breathing." The chipped ceramic mug warmed Leo's hands, but did little for the chill that had settled deep in his bones. 3 days. 3 days since the coded message from Maggie. 3 days chasing whispers and dead ends, fueled by stale coffee and a growing dread. Maggie hadn't given him a location, just a state in Montana, and a name, a false one, Sarah Jenkins. It felt flimsy, a thread he was grasping at in the dark. He'd found the cabin thanks to a local bookstore owner in Whitefish, who remembered a woman fitting Clara's description, buying maps of the Flathead National Forest, asking specifically about abandoned logging roads. The woman had paid cash, insisted on paper, and seemed haunted. The cabin itself was nestled amongst a thick stand of pines, smoke curling from the chimney a fragile signal in the vast wilderness. It looked lived in, cared for. He killed the engine, the silence of the woods pressing in around him. He checked the Glock beneath his jacket. It felt inadequate, a band-aid on a gaping wound. He walked slowly, crunching through the frosted undergrowth. The door wasn't locked. He pushed it open, stepping into a single-room space filled with the scent of wood smoke and something else. Cinnamon. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on rough, hewn walls. A woman was sitting by the fire, back to him, meticulously stitching a quilt. The back of her head, the way her dark hair was pulled into a practical braid. It was Clara. He didn't say anything, just stood there, letting the reality of it sink in. She didn't react, didn't flinch. After a long moment, she slowly turned, and he saw the change in her. The vibrant, quick-witted Clara he'd known was muted, shadowed. Her eyes, once sparkling with intelligence, held a wary, fragile light. "Leo." The voice was a breath, barely audible. "Clara." He kept his tone even, gentle. "Maggie sent me." A flicker of something twin relief, perhaps. Free crossed her face. She gestured to a worn armchair opposite the fire. "It has been a while." He sat, the springs groaning beneath his weight. The air was thick with unspoken questions. He let her breathe, let her gather herself. He'd learned covering stories like this, that pushing only made things worse. "Sarah Jenkins," he said quietly. Good alias. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Sheriff Brody helped me with it. Along with everything else, Brody, her father's friend. Leo's gut twisted. Brody knew you were here. Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the flames. He is the reason I'm alive, Leo. He has been protecting me. She began to unravel the story, a tangled thread of fear, betrayal, and a carefully constructed conspiracy. It started, she explained, weeks before her father, Daniel, had died. He'd been getting close, too close, to Vance, not just with the land deals, but with something dirtier. Something about offshore accounts and untraceable funds. He came to Brody, desperate. He said he needed someone he could trust, someone outside of Vance's reach, someone who could help him connect the dots. Brody, it turned out, had been quietly investigating Vance for years, suspecting corruption within the county commission. He'd wanted to build a case, but Vance's wealth and influence had been an insurmountable barrier. Daniel's information provided the leverage he needed, but also amplified the risk. My father believed Vance was involved in his accident, Clara said, her voice flat. He'd told Brody he'd received a veiled threat, a warning to back off. Leo felt a surge of anger, hot and consuming. He'd always had a nagging feeling about Daniel's death being more than it seemed. The official report had ruled it a hunting accident, but something had never felt right. Brody thought going to the police wouldn't work, Clara continued. Vance owned half the town, half the force. He'd have buried the evidence, discredited my father's findings, and made my life a living hell. Brody had suggested she disappear, to start over, to be safe. He provided her with the alias, the money for the cabin, and a promise of ongoing protection. He checked in periodically, leaving supplies, ensuring she wasn't followed. He knew I needed to vanish, to become someone else. He said it was the only way. Why didn't he come forward? Leo asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. He was playing the long game. He knew he needed proof, concrete evidence. He was gathering it, slowly, meticulously, he said. He said he needed to be careful not to spook Vance. She paused, her hands trembling as she resumed her stitching. He thought if he could build a solid case, he could take Vance down from the inside. Leo ran a hand through his hair. Brody, a quiet, unassuming sheriff, operating in the shadows, taking on a man like Vance. It was a dangerous game, and Leo couldn't shake the feeling that Brody had been playing it alone for too long. Did your father mention anything specific? Any names? Any details? Beyond the land deals? Clara hesitated, her gaze darting around the cabin as if afraid of being overheard. She rose and went to a small wooden chest tucked beneath the window. She unlocked it with a tiny brass key and retrieved a worn leather-bound book. My father kept a journal. He didn't trust computers, said they were too easily hacked. He wrote everything down, coded, of course. She flipped through the pages, stopping at a section near the end. He was tracking Vance's finances, trying to find where the money was going. He suspected Vance was laundering money through the farms, inflating the land values, and skimming off the top. And Leo pressed. He discovered a pattern, a series of transactions, all routed through a shell corporation. He was trying to trace the ultimate beneficiary when she trailed off, her voice choked with emotion. What was the shell corporation called? Evergreen Holdings. And the transactions. Clara's fingers trembled as she pointed to a series of numbers and initials scribbled in the margin. He believed they were linked to Congressman Harrison. Leo felt a jolt of disbelief. Harrison, the state's beloved representative. The champion of rural communities. It seemed impossible. He'd met Harrison once at a fundraising dinner. The man had seemed genuinely concerned about the plight of the farmers. Are you sure? Clara nodded, her eyes filled with a bleak certainty. My father was meticulous. He wouldn't have made a mistake. She closed the journal, her hand resting on the cover. The weight of the revelation settled over Leo, like a shroud. He'd been chasing a monster, but he hadn't realized how far its tentacles reached. There is one more thing, she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Something Brody asked me to hold on to, in case anything happened to him. She reached back into the chest and retrieved a smaller, more discreet ledger, bound in dark blue fabric. It was old, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. He said this contained everything, every transaction, every name, every detail. Clara opened the ledger, revealing neat columns of figures and handwritten notes. He said it is proof of everything, and it names someone else, someone working directly with Vance, someone within the bank that handled many of the transactions. She flipped to a specific page. As Leo leaned closer, his blood ran cold. The name staring back at him was one he recognized, not from Vance's world, but from his own past. Old Man Hemlock, the seemingly harmless, elderly banker who'd always been so helpful with his research, the one who had smoothly directed him away from any questioning of Vance's financial dealings. Hemlock, Leo breathed, disbelief warring with understanding. It seems Vance had help from the inside. Suddenly, the cabin door burst open and Brody strode in, his face a mask of grim determination. He was flanked by two uniformed deputies. Behind them stood a bewildered-looking farmer, Jebediah Croft, the man who'd sold Vance the land. "It is over, Vance," Brody said, his voice ringing with authority. "We have a warrant for your arrest, and yours, Jebediah. You're coming with us." Vance, looking disheveled and furious, was already being restrained by Brody's deputies. He hadn't anticipated this. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared, struggling against their grip. "We know about the land scams, Vance," Brody said, his voice steely. "We know about the money laundering. We know about Congressman Harrison, and we know about your accomplice at the bank." He glanced at Hemlock's name in the ledger Clara was holding. Vance's face contorted with rage. He opened his mouth to speak, but Brody cut him off. "You have the right to remain silent." The arrests were swift and efficient. Vance and Croft were bundled into the patrol cars, their faces etched with disbelief and anger. The local news crews, alerted by Brody, descended on the cabin, cameras flashing. As the chaos subsided, Leo approached Brody, shaking his head in amazement. "You orchestrated this?" Brody nodded, a weary smile playing on his lips. "Had to, Leo. Couldn't risk letting him get away with it. With your help, and Clara's father's meticulous notes, we finally had enough." He turned to Clara, his expression softening. "You're safe now, Sarah. This is over." "It is Clara," she corrected softly, a hint of her old spirit returning. She looked at Leo, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, Leo." But as the deputies led the farmer away, his gaze locked with Clara's, and a single chilling word escaped his lips. "Not over." A name on the ledger hit Leo like a physical blow. Alistair Finch. Alistair Finch, the patriarch of Finch Vineyards. A man Leo had known his entire life. A close friend of his grandfather, a pillar of the Napa Valley wine community. A man he'd always considered an elder statesman, a mentor. The ledger meticulously detailed Finch's role in Vance's scheme, soon laundering money, providing legal cover-ups, and silencing anyone who threatened their operation. He'd been the silent partner, the hidden hand pulling the strings. The revelation shattered Leo's world. He'd spent years building his life around the idealized memory of his grandfather, believing him to be a man of integrity and principle. Now, the ledger suggested a darker truth, that his grandfather had knowingly associated with a corrupt individual, perhaps even benefited from his schemes. He remembered countless summer evenings spent at the Finch Estate, sharing wine and stories with Alistair and his grandfather. Had those conversations been carefully orchestrated? Had his grandfather been complicit in something he hadn't understood? He found Alistair Finch at his vineyard, overseeing the harvest. Finch, impeccably dressed as always, greeted Leo with a warm smile, completely unaware of the storm brewing. "Leo, my boy, what a pleasant surprise. How is Bellamont coming along?" Leo didn't bother with pleasantries. He simply laid the ledger on the table, the weight of the evidence heavy in the air. Finch's face drained of color as he scanned the pages. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. This is absurd," he stammered. "Fabricated. I have no idea where you got this. It is from a hidden compartment in my grandfather's desk," Leo said, his voice cold. "He kept meticulous records, Mr. Finch, and it is all here. Your involvement in Vance's criminal enterprise, the money laundering, the intimidation, everything." Finch's carefully constructed forehead crumbled. He slumped onto a nearby chair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "It was a different time, Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We all made mistakes. We were young, ambitious, desperate to succeed, desperate enough to ruin lives, to silence anyone who got in your way." Finch didn't respond. He knew there was no defending himself. The arrest of Alistair Finch sent shockwaves through the Napa Valley. A man revered for his contributions to the wine industry, exposed as a criminal mastermind. The fallout was immediate and widespread. Several other individuals implicated in the scheme were taken into custody, including a number of prominent politicians and business leaders. Sheriff Brody, working with the FBI, orchestrated a massive investigation that unearthed a network of corruption that had been festering for decades. Vance, Hemlock, and their accomplices faced a litany of charges, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. The reforms were sweeping: enhanced oversight of the wine industry, stricter regulations on land acquisitions, and a renewed focus on ethical business practices. The scandal forced a reckoning, a painful but necessary cleansing of the valley's underbelly. As the dust settled, Leo found himself facing a new chapter. His reputation, tarnished for so long, began to be restored. He was hailed as a hero, the man who had finally brought the truth to light. Offers to rejoin the sheriff's department poured in, but he politely declined. He'd found peace in a different kind of service, restoring Bellamont and honoring his family's legacy. He spent months tending to the vineyards, pruning the vines and nurturing the grapes. He experimented with new techniques, blending tradition with innovation. He reopened the tasting room, welcoming visitors with a genuine warmth he hadn't felt in years. He'd also established a foundation in Clara Moreau's name, providing scholarships for aspiring artists in the Napa Valley. It was a small gesture, a way of honoring her memory and ensuring that her passion for art would live on. One afternoon he stood overlooking the vineyards, the golden light of the setting, sun bathing the rolling hills in a warm glow. He closed his eyes, breathing in the earthy scent of the grapes and the breeze rustling through the leaves. He had unraveled the tangled web of deceit, exposed the darkness that had haunted his past, and brought a measure of justice to those who had been wronged. He'd found closure, not through revenge, but through truth and reconciliation. He understood now that his grandfather, despite his flaws and his association with Alistair Finch, had been a good man, a man who loved his family and his land. He hadn't been a hero, but he hadn't been a villain either. He'd been a complex individual, navigating a complicated world, making difficult choices, and Clara, though her life had been tragically cut short, had left an indelible mark on the valley, a legacy of beauty and integrity. He touched the rough bark of a vine, a silent promise to protect the land, to honor the past, and to build a better future. The weight on his shoulders had lifted, the ghosts had finally quieted. He'd uncorked the truth, and in doing so, he'd finally found his own vintage justice. He looked forward to the future, tending to his vines, and crafting wines that would tell the story of Bellamont, of Napa Valley, and of the enduring power of hope. The harvest moon, no longer a symbol of darkness, now shone brightly, illuminating a path towards a brighter tomorrow.